Oh, Lewis Wall. Kia ora.
Very much for the opportunity to contribute to the committee stage debate on the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill. And firstly, I want to acknowledge that this bill stemmed from recommendations within the Canterbury Earthquakes Royal Commission made in its Volume 4 final report released by the government in December 2012. And the recommendations focused on the legislation, policies and practices underpinning New Zealand's approach to earthquake-prone buildings in the wake of the Canterbury earthquakes. I specifically do want to focus most of my contribution to Supplementary Order Paper number 152 by David Seymour, and his wanting to add to Section 133AA L, a building located in an area of low seismic risk. And it's relevant for my electorate because the examples used are Auckland, Northland and Dunedin. So as an MP based in South Auckland, obviously it's highly relevant to my community. So one of the things you do when you given an opportunity to speak in a bill that actually is incredibly technical. So I want to take the opportunity to also congratulate the Select Committee, the Local Government Environment Committee, for actually going through a process of being able to present a piece of legislation to the House that fulfils those recommendations of the Royal Commission, because I can see it was a highly technical bill. And so the next piece of information I'm going to share is actually highly technical as well. And so what I did was found a GNS Science report that was presented to the Senior Hazards Advisor of Auckland Council, and it's titled Benefits of Strengthening Earthquake-Prone Buildings in Auckland. It's dated the 18th of February 2014. And so the interesting thing about this, I'll call it a piece of evidence that's relevant, is that what they went through was an exercise of identifying all the deficient buildings in Auckland. And believe it or not, there are 526,000 buildings in Auckland. And what they found was that there were 9,794 buildings that were deficient. And what they then went through was a process of modelling that said, if we looked at, and this is where it becomes really interesting, if we looked at earthquakes in a 200,000-year-long synthetic catalogue of earthquakes, and we looked at buildings that weren't strengthened, and then if we actually strengthened these 9,794 buildings, what will the impact be? And so I'm going to read it out because it's actually incredibly fascinating. So what it essentially says is the buildings that haven't been brought up to standard, I suppose, every 10,000 years, there's a probability, a chance of a severe earthquake that is 0.0001%. And within that category, there will be 107 deaths, there will be 1 critical injury, there will be 71 serious injuries, and there will be 922 moderate injuries. And the other interesting statistic is that, in fact, of those 526,000 buildings, 87,755, or 17% of the total buildings, would be affected. And so at the lower end of the spectrum, so at the higher end of the spectrum, 107 people would die. At the lower end of the spectrum, the probability of an earthquake every 200 years was 0.005. 2 deaths, 0 critical injuries, 4 serious injuries, and 61 moderate injuries. And 12,663, or 2.4% of the buildings were affected. So these are buildings where, of those 9,794 buildings, we did nothing to them. So we didn't do anything. Now here's where it gets really interesting, because the next modelling is, okay, we made all those deficient buildings sound. And these were the statistics. So The most severe, so 0.0001, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Every 10,000 years, there were 104 deaths, so actually only a reduction of 3 deaths. There was 1 critical injury. There were 69 serious injuries, a reduction of 2, and there were 890 moderate injuries, a reduction of 32. And at the lower end of the spectrum where a person died, 0.005% probability every 200 years. There were 2 deaths, there were 0 critical injuries, there were 4 serious injuries, and there were 60 moderate injuries, only a 1% reduction, reduction in moderate injuries. And so I think actually when you look at those statistics, it's interesting because I actually think David Seymour has brought an incredibly important issue to the table, and his supplementary order paper, therefore, based on this evidence, should be supported, with one caveat, and it's a caveat in the report itself, which says that there are some shortcomings in terms of the modelling, and this in fact reinforces what my colleague David Parker said, because it was very hard to estimate casualties arising from the fall of weak brick chimneys, architectural ornaments and unbraced parapets. And so although overall the results of this particular piece of research says that the earthquake risk in Auckland is small, and that the benefits of upgrading earthquake-prone buildings to a minimum of 33% of the new building standard are very small, it also must be remembered that earthquake risk in Auckland is not 0, and that, where's this thing? And that these chimneys and architectural ornaments and unbraced parapets should be classified as dangerous. And I guess that's the opportunity or the lesson from Canterbury my colleague Portia Williams is saying, that maybe there is some merit in actually doing something about those items on some of our buildings. And so my contribution really is in support of David Seymour's supplementary order paper. It's going to be interesting to see how that's voted on throughout the evening, but I've really appreciated actually an opportunity to do a bit more investigation into this piece of legislation. It's a very serious issue. I have lots of aroha for the people of Christchurch, but obviously this piece of legislation is relevant to everybody, and so the contribution that I've made hopefully will just provide some relevance to the people of Tāmaki Makaurau. Kia ora.
I call